Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Aquarian Insights. Today, I am honored to have Dr. Stephanie Seneff here. And Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT. And since 2008, she has directed her attention towards nutrition and environmental toxicants and their role in human disease, with a special emphasis on glyphosate, the mineral sulfur, and the role of deuterium within the human body. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Seneff here today because to me, she epitomizes the spirit of a true scientist, always trying to push the boundaries and ask why, ask the inconvenient questions, and find answers to those things. And Dr. Seneff's work on glyphosate has been so important for me clinically, working with people with complex chronic conditions like autism and neurodegenerative conditions. And so I'm so happy to have Dr. Seneff here today to talk about all things glyphosate and deuterium. So welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
And I think we talked off camera a little bit, but one of the beautiful things is as I went back and sort of reread some of your research from 10 years ago up until now, one of the beautiful things is how everything has sort of fallen into place. And you've had this logical progression sort of in your thinking. And the more that you research, it reinforces all the things that you said 10, 15 years ago. And especially around the role between glyphosate and sulfate and deuterium. And so my hope today for folks, if they're not super familiar with your work, is we can kind of start a little bit at the beginning and then move from kind of glyphosate into deuterium and sort of beyond that. So perhaps we can start the discussion around glyphosate. And I know most folks kind of know what it is, but maybe we can get into sort of why it's so important to be aware of it and kind of how really it affects health negatively for folks.
Sure. Yes. Of course, glyphosate's really been a focus of my life for the last 10, 15 years. And I really believe that it is the primary cause of the autism epidemic. And I've been very concerned about autism. That's what got me on this whole path back in the mid 2000s when I started seeing autism rates going up every year. And then this excuse that we're just diagnosing it more, which I was sure was not true.
Right.
It can't be that I never knew anybody. I didn't know the word autism when I was a child. There was basically no such thing. And now it's just so common that almost everybody knows someone who has autism. It seems like to me today, it's just incredibly common and getting worse and worse every year still today. Yeah. So I'm very concerned about it. I think the autism epidemic is really going to cause huge problems in this country. It's going to get to the point where everyone who's healthy enough to take care of people is going to be taking care of everybody who's sick. And that's all we're going to be doing. It seems to me like we're headed in that direction because it's not just autism. We have so many diseases that are going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. And glyphosate's Roundup, and people usually know Roundup. You can go buy it at the local garden store and put it on your dandelions and kill them very efficiently. It's supposedly completely non-toxic to humans. They say it's like aspirin. It's so safe. And this is the message that we're receiving from the government. And the government has been fooled by the industry. And of course, they've also been supported by the industry to the point where they don't want to see that glyphosate is toxic. So I've been very frustrated with the government for refusing to acknowledge that this chemical is causing a huge amount of trouble. And people, friends of mine like Zen Honeycutt, who is the founder of Moms Across America, she is really amazing. And she has just gone after all these different categories of food that are very common for children. The school lunches of the public schools, the fast food industry. She's looking at formula now. She did breast milk. So she's been looking for glyphosate contamination in all of these things, and she's been finding it 95%, 100%. I mean, it's that kind of numbers, contamination in all the samples that she gets tested. Wow. So it is pervasive in the food supply. And it is, I think, our kids are being poisoned every time they eat, basically. And we need to get rid of it. I believe it needs to be banned. Like, we have to stop manufacturing and close it down. And of course, what will happen, perhaps, is that they'll just start using these other herbicides, which are considered to be much more toxic than glyphosate. That's not going to solve the problem. So we need to figure out how to go back to the kind of agriculture we used to do. To figure out how to grow food efficiently and low cost and not using chemicals. I think the insecticides, the fungicides, and the herbicides have all got to go.
Yeah.
if we plan on being healthy. That's what I believe at this point. So that's where I stand. I haven't told you
Yeah.
anything about the mechanism, but I can certainly go there.
No. I think that's such an important thing. And for me, kind of with a lot of folks, they understand sort of the roles of different things in their health, but still there's this thing where, well, I can spray it on my lawn or I can spray it on my backyard garden. It has to be safe.
Yes, exactly.
And that has pervaded for generations now.
Yes,
And so we're in real big trouble because people don't understand the mechanisms and why this is so dangerous. And even to the point, reviewing your research, the more that I do, the more I realize that this is one of the top two, maybe three most dangerous things that is inundating our body now. And
I
the fact
agree.
that
Yeah,
people just aren't discussing it enough or don't see the value in it is quite concerning, to be honest.
right. And the thing is that it's a slow kill. It's insidious
Right.
and cumulative. So it gets into all your tissues and it stays there. And so as you get older, you get more. It just keeps accumulating. And eventually something breaks because of too much glyphosate. And it affects so many enzymes, messing them up. You can't believe how many enzymes that it suppresses, or even just, causes something. Even I suspect it even causes a misfolding that leads to Alzheimer's disease of the prion protein.
Yeah.
So it's, really scary that it can do all these things, and it does them slowly and insidiously. And then so you get sick with something and you don't know why, but but you can trace it back to glyphosate in many cases. And I can do that with all these different diseases that are going up. And I've done that in my book, to really cover various enzymes that I've singled out as being extremely susceptible to glyphosate toxicity. And if that enzyme is broken, then you get this disease, which happens to be going up in step with glyphosate. So you can connect all those dots and figure out how one chemical could be causing so many diseases.
Yeah, and on that point, I have it behind me on my shelf there. I show all of my patients, but if you haven't read Dr. Seneff's book, Toxic Legacy,
Yeah, I've
please,
got it here. I can hold
please.
it up. This is, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. That is the most important book of our time, in my opinion. So
Wow,
please,
thank you.
anyone who can get their hands on it, read that book. And with glyphosate, I think one of the beautiful things that you've sort of come up with is, and I've appreciated so much about your research, is understanding the importance of it and how it's affecting all of these modern diseases, but then also coming up with solutions. And
Mm-hmm.
you've always, since you started doing all this, you've always wanted to propose solutions,
Mm-hmm.
which I very much appreciate. Because when we're trying to cross this bridge of seemingly big, scary things, if we don't have solutions, then we just get relegated into this fear.
Mm-hmm.
But you've always tried to propose solutions. So maybe you could kind of talk to us a little bit about that, what you've seen work, and sort of what you've done about the glyphosate problem.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's sort of a simple formula of a healthy lifestyle. And a lot of it is just being natural is really what it
Right,
comes down to,
right.
being natural. And so it's critical is the food supply. And you
Mhm,
need to take the time, I think, to cook. You need to use herbs and
mhm.
spices, really spice up your food, everything organic and everything natural, not processed foods, highly unprocessed foods.
Yeah.
And I think if you just did that, organic, unprocessed, and using lots of herbs and spices, you'd get pretty far. And then I also emphasize sulfur, of course. A lot of my book is about sulfur because I think sulfur, and in more particularly sulfate deficiency, is a key driver behind autism and other diseases as well. And so dietary sulfur is something that they don't pay attention to. They have certain limit, they have minimum daily requirements for a lot of different things that the government specifies, but not sulfur. It's like, it's fine, don't worry about it, which is not true because it becomes deficient because glyphosate disrupts the ability of the plants to take up the sulfur.
Mhm.
And so that you end up with a sulfur deficient diet. And then on top of that, your microbes, which normally manage sulfur in an important, they do a lot for the host. They do so many things for the host. Our cells are pretty pathetic, actually, because there's so many things they can't do. And we rely on our microbes to do those things. And then our microbes get hurt by glyphosate. And so they can't perform the way they should. And one of the critical things that it messes up is the whole sulfur system that ends up putting sulfate into the glycocalyx, which is lining all the blood vessels. There's this heparan sulfate, and heparan sulfate deficiency is, I think, a key factor in autism. I've seen papers, multiple papers on both mice and humans, and postmortem studies on autistic kids who died, and then looking at their brain and finding out that there's very low heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles, very specific. And there was a study on mice where they actually poisoned the mice by injecting a chemical into their brain ventricles to suppress the ability to make the heparan sulfate. And those mice exhibited the mouse symptoms of autism. It was quite remarkable. Just that one change caused autism in those mice. So I think it's very important, the heparan sulfate. And there was a recent paper on autism last couple of years, which was very interesting to me because it showed that the autistic kids have a defect in the enzymes that attach sulfate to things, to these all kinds of molecules. There's lots of molecules for which it's important to attach sulfate in order to be able to distribute them throughout the body. And they showed a specific deficiency in what's called a sulfotransferase in the gut, in the blood, and in the brain ventricles, in the pineal gland. And so if the pineal gland is disabled in terms of being able to put sulfate onto things, one thing is the melatonin sulfate. The melatonin that is shipped out by the pineal gland it's pretty much 100% sulfated, and it's distributed into the cerebral spinal fluid, and then it reaches the neurons. And it's very important for sleep, the melatonin sulfate. But if they can't put the sulfate on the melatonin, that's a big problem. And they showed this deficiency of heparan sulfate sulfotransferase in the brain ventricles in the humans. This study was looking at humans. They had post-mortem data on humans, and they showed a deficiency in the enzyme that puts the sulfate onto the heparan sulfate and in the heparan sulfate itself, severely deficient in the humans. And then they had the same thing in the mice. So it's very striking that there's a sulfate problem with the autistic kids. They also flush sulfate. They throw it out through the urine. And in fact, they throw out a lot of sulfate metabolites, sulfur metabolites like sulfite and thiosulfate. They show up in very high levels in the urine of autistic kids. This is something that was discovered many years ago, and I'm forgetting her name. I won't go there. Okay. I lose names, so I'm sorry. Okay. But there was a woman who was a researcher and looked at autistic kids, and a pioneer really in the 1990s, and she showed sulfate problems in the autistic kids, and she felt that was a key factor in their autism.
And you've spoken before just on the relation to sulfate, not only dietary consumption, but then also with respect to sunlight. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yes, and I should continue with my program for what's good for health, and sunlight is right up there. I really believe in sunlight, and that's not, I tell people you got to get out in the sun. They say, yeah, I know vitamin D is important. And I say, no, not vitamin D, sunlight. A lot of people, your dermatologist will say, stay out of the sun and take the vitamin D pill. I do not agree with that. In fact, I've never taken a vitamin D pill. And my vitamin D levels are high because I get out in the sun a lot and I really work at it, And I think it's super, super important to get enough sunlight. And what the mothers are being taught is, you got to slobber the sunscreen all over the kid because they're going to get skin cancer. And even cover them up. They're really worried about the sun poisoning the kids. And that's the opposite of what it should be, because the sun is health giving. I mean, it's there as a resource. Plants have learned how to use it so well with the chlorophyll to actually turn inorganic, carbon dioxide into organic matter. That is so crucial with the photosynthesis. And so the animals are using sunlight too. And I believe that sunlight operates as it's actually, we have a battery. We have solar panels on our skin, that are picking up the sunlight and turning it into energy that we can use in our body. And that's really fascinating. That gets into the work of Gerald Pollack with the gelled water and how that creates a battery. And he showed experimentally that when you shine infrared light, which is of course sort of part of the sunlight, spectrum, infrared light will cause that exclusion zone water, which is gelled water, to grow by a factor of 4. He showed that experimentally. So you're increasing the battery productivity by getting out in the sun. And so you're using light as a source of energy. Which makes a whole lot of sense, because there is that sun all this time. It's been there on the earth, begging us to use it, really, so how would life not figure out how to take advantage of that energy source? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating things as a clinician that I've noticed, especially in the last 10 years, is people have succumbed to these sort of mainstream ideas that the sun is bad for us and we shouldn't do these things. And I've seen people's health get far more complicated just because they've removed the simple free things that we should be doing every day to install health into us.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me that you could think that the sun would be toxic. And I know, in fact, sunscreen use has been going up dramatically over time, probably in step with matching well with the rise in glyphosate usage over time over the past 20 years. We've now got these very high protection factors of like 60, it used to be like 8 or 10. And now we've gotten so obsessed with protecting from the sun. And meanwhile, the cancer of the skin, the melanoma skin cancer has been going up also, in matching the rise in the use of sunscreen. So, I mean, that doesn't make sense, right? If we're using all this sunscreen, we should be protecting ourselves, and we're not. We're making it worse. It's got a lot of the sunscreen has aluminum in it, and aluminum messes up the enzyme. In my opinion, I have some of it's theoretical, but the aluminum actually suppresses an enzyme called eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And I believe that enzyme actually also makes sulfur dioxide, which turns into sulfate in response to sunlight. And so, but aluminum actually breaks that enzyme, and so does glyphosate. It's a member, an orphan, they call it orphan member of the cytochrome P450 family of enzymes. And glyphosate suppresses many CYP enzymes. So CYP is a nickname for that in the liver.
Yep.
And those enzymes in the liver do all kinds of amazing things for the host. So when they're broken, not only is the liver in trouble, but a lot of other things are too. In fact, you can't detoxify fat soluble toxic chemicals when those enzymes aren't working.
Yeah, and that's one of the most amazing things. We see folks come in from other physicians or through other, different practitioners and stuff, and they have these severe liver problems and troubles with detoxification, and no one has once talked to them about the role of glyphosate. No one has once talked to them about the role of sulfate or any of these things.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And they've been put on probiotics and all of this stuff, and it's like, well, we have to go back a second and sort of work on these things. And one of the other things with respect to kind of the glyphosate that I found so fascinating that you had written about before was B12 deficiency in that relation to glyphosate. Could you explain that a little bit?
That's right. Yeah, glyphosate disrupts the absorption of B12 by the gut, so it doesn't. It becomes deficient even if you're taking high doses of B12. It doesn't get through. It doesn't get through the gut lining because glyphosate messes up the ability of those endothelial cells lining the gut to get the glyphosate into the circulation, to get the cobalamin into the circulation. Cobalamin is a very big molecule, and there's all these special things that go on with respect to protecting it from getting digested in the stomach, and those things are done by cells that are very sensitive to glyphosate, because the low pH of the stomach facilitates glyphosate entry into the cells. And so those cells in the stomach that acidify the stomach get broken by glyphosate, and there's a process that involves the cobalamin to protect it from getting broken down that becomes defective because those cells are broken. We wrote a paper about that, Greg and I we had a lot of fun with that paper, and it goes into a lot of the biochemistry of the whole cobalamin pathway, and ends up arguing that this sulfate deficiency becomes an issue because of all of that. Cobalamin is such an important enzyme. Sorry, not enzyme. Vitamin. Sorry,
yeah,
B12.
Yeah.
Vitamin B12. Yeah, and a lot of people have B12 deficiency, and it can be a source of dementia. You can actually have people who appear to have dementia, but if you fix the B12 problem, the dementia goes away. Yeah. So that's really striking. So, I think B12 deficiency is a feature of autism. And again, it's because glyphosate is messing up. All the B vitamins are in trouble with glyphosate. And so I think the autistic kids have deficiencies in like B2, B3, B6, B12, all of them.
Right.
And they're all really, really important for metabolism. And it ends up, directly affecting the mitochondria too, so that your energy, mitochondria become sick and they can't make enough ATP, and they produce too many reactive oxygen species, which start destroying. It can cause a DNA damage to the mitochondrial DNA, and then you can end up with cancer. So, I mean, there's just a whole cascade of things that can go wrong because of this deficiency in the B vitamins. And that also goes back to the gut microbes, because glyphosate specifically preferentially suppresses bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. And those are the two key species that populate the infant gut. And they're both getting affected by glyphosate. And when they're not working well, those B vitamins become deficient, because they're supplying the B vitamins for the host. Our cells don't know how to make B vitamins.
Mhm.
but the microbes can, and they make them for the host. And when they're broken, when the microbes are sick, then the B vitamins go down, and you don't get enough. And so there's a lot of deficiencies that are associated with autism. B12, cobalamin, and B2, riboflavin, that's a big
Yep.
one, and B3, niacin. They're all problematic with the autistic kids, and I think it's just the microbes are not able to perform their tasks that they would normally do for the host adequately to keep them supplied with the amount that they need to work well. So
And so in just giving advice to maybe new moms to sort of protect your children, whether it be practices with breastfeeding, obviously once they start eating, going organic and all of that, but with respect to breastfeeding and then how you transition them to avoid glyphosate exposure, because obviously if mom's consuming things, then that's not going to be very good for baby. But is there things that you have seen or come across that would be helpful for especially fostering those good bacteria in young kids?
yeah, well, I certainly believe in eating a high sulfur diet is one
Hmm.
thing, and that includes cruciferous vegetables and
Hmm.
onions and garlic. And for the mother, if she's nursing, to make sure to get a high sulfur diet to
Hmm.
help with the supply of sulfur in her milk. You know, and as you know, I like walking outdoors
Right.
by the ocean in the water.
Mhm.
You get good grounding, and you can actually get sulfur uptake from the water. And of
That's
course,
nice.
using Epsom salt baths is something I do routinely.
Hmm.
And again, to get sulfur into the system, because I
Yeah.
think the sulfur is critical for, they need to have enough of it. And then of course, glyphosate makes sulfur toxic. So what happens to a lot of people is they become sulfur sensitive, and then they avoid foods that contain sulfur. And that ends up with an even worse sulfur deficiency problem. But they're kind of stuck, because what happens is this enzyme sulfite oxidase becomes suppressed by glyphosate, and then sulfite becomes toxic and sulfate becomes deficient, because that produces sulfate from sulfite. So you get both sulfate deficiency and sulfite toxicity at the same time if that
Yeah.
enzyme's broken.
Yeah, and that was you read my mind because that was going to sort of be one of my next questions. And when folks are in that position, what is based on what you know, what is your recommendation on the safest way to get out of that?
I
Obviously,
think it's to start with
glyphosate.
the organic diet,
Okay.
and then hope that that will reduce the glyphosate burden,
Hmm.
which might then even reverse the sulfite sensitivity problem, that you might
Hmm.
then be able to eat the sulfur containing foods. So it would be a process. And also, of course, Epsom salt baths would be very important, I think, for someone who has sulfur sensitivity, because you're bypassing the gut. It's coming in from the
Yes.
skin, getting into the blood. So that's a way to get sulfur without the complications of the microbes and all the stuff that's going on in the gut.
And I wanted to touch a little bit on the role between glyphosate and aluminum. And we've been talking about the gut a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of explain for folks how the effect of glyphosate on the gut sort of precipitates aluminum toxicity. Because I think for me, just clinically, the two of the most biggest things right now that folks are facing, regardless of what label they've been given or condition they've been told they have, is aluminum toxicity and glyphosate toxicity.
That makes a whole lot of sense.
So perhaps, give folks a little bit of what you think's going on with respect to how glyphosate affects the gut and then in turn creates aluminum toxicity.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on that, actually, specifically on that, glyphosate and aluminum working synergistically to cause pineal gland damage,
Yes.
interestingly. And which is really fascinating topic to study. What I think is, first of all, glyphosate has been shown to cause a leaky gut, and that allows things to
Hmm.
get past the barrier. And the problem with glyphosate and aluminum is that aluminum is a +3 charge. So it's a very highly positive charged atom, which is part of its toxicity, is because of the +3 charge.
Hmm.
Glyphosate, two glyphosate molecules will bind to aluminum and hide that erase the +3 charge, because the glyphosates are negatively charged. And one can be -2, one's -1. The whole molecule that's formed from those two glyphosates bound with aluminum inside them is no charge. And once it's not charged, it's very easy for it to get across the gut barrier and go into the circulation. And then that same monster molecule makes its way to the pineal gland, where the acidity of the blood goes down. It's at the terminal shed terminal parts of the blood, the pineal gland and also the kidneys, the pH goes down. So it's a lower pH allows glyphosate to let go. So it basically delivers free aluminum to the pineal gland, which is outside of the blood-brain barrier. So that makes it very susceptible, and delivers glyphosate at the same time, because when the two separate, when the aluminum separates from the glyphosate, all of them become very toxic to the pineal gland. And the glyphosate shuts down the sulfate ability to add sulfate to melatonin. And melatonin comes from serotonin, which comes from tryptophan, which is one of the molecules that the guts are making. The gut microbes are making tryptophan for the host using the pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts. So the tryptophan is deficient, the serotonin is deficient, the melatonin is deficient, and the ability to add sulfate to the melatonin is deficient. And so glyphosate, it really is a train wreck for melatonin. And then you get sleep disorder, which is another condition that's going up dramatically exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate.
Right. And one of the things too, and we can touch on this a little bit if you want, but you've done an extensive amount of research looking at glyphosate content within certain types of vaccinations. And we know
Yes.
that we know that aluminum is an adjuvant to pretty much all of the vaccines now. So to me, regardless of what everyone thinks about efficacy of vaccines, you're inducing a glyphosate aluminum payload directly into the blood, and that's going to have consequences.
Absolutely. I wonder to what extent the glyphosate that's in the MMR vaccine is contributing to the link between MMR and autism, which of course the mainstream insists is not true. It's a quote unquote conspiracy theory. And but I think it makes sense if the vaccine, because MMR had the highest levels of glyphosate compared to all the vaccines that were tested, but many had glyphosate in them.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, of the children that I see, 9 times out of 10, one of the parents or both parents come in and say they were doing okay, and then they got the MMR vaccine. And I know I'm not the only one who has that experience clinically. And so I think the levels of glyphosate within the MMR combined with the adjuvants is probably explanatory for that, in my opinion. But
yeah, and you often get it together with other vaccines that have aluminum.
right, you get it with a whole bunch of other ones.
So you're getting the whole package all at once. You get several vaccines. I mean, it's so incredible how many vaccines the kids get today. I mean, it was hard. I actually did vaccinate my kids right up until almost the end when it was a DPT shot that I got rid of for my youngest son. And it was kind of the last shot that any of the kids required, like I was all done. And I told the doctor, because I had a friend who had a son who got a DPT shot. He ran a high fever, piercing cry. A week later, he had seizures, and he was later diagnosed with autism. So that sort of made me think maybe the DPT shot caused the autism. So I said, and my son was due for a booster. And I said, I'm not, I told the doctor no. And he didn't blink an eye. He said, yeah, well, actually, it's probably going to be taken off the market very soon because we're getting so many lawsuits. This was right before they set up that 1986 rule that protected the industry.
Wow.
And so, but there were so few vaccines. I was lucky because my kids all grew up before there was after 1886, then they started rolling out all these vaccines, and it's just incredible. I can't believe going to the doctor and saying, oh, well, they need 5 different, vaccines today. They're due for all these vaccines. And I wouldn't say, sure, no problem, go ahead. I wouldn't. I think I would be homeschooling my kids if I had young kids today. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think that is the overwhelming struggle that most parents are facing now. And just the reality, to your point, like when I was growing up and my parents were growing up and everything, we had 4 or 5 of them maybe spread out over years. And now we're getting this concoction of metals and glyphosate and all
and
of
more
this.
and more boosters. Now the teenagers are getting boosters. I mean, it's just insane. I actually have slowly but methodically reached a point of view at this moment. If you ask me, are there any vaccines that I would recommend? I would say no. I think we should just abandon the entire industry. That's my opinion. And I think we've been trained to believe that if we didn't vaccinate the kids, we'd all be getting smallpox and polio and dying. It's just not true, because the things that really solved the problem of these infections was sanitation. Sanitation was a really big one. And of course, health, eating healthy food. So when kids have a weak immune system, that's when they get sick with diseases. So if you have a strong immune system, you won't even get a cold, you know.
Right.
And actually, today's kids get a lot more colds than they did when I was young, or even when my kids were young. I've noticed that the kids are always out of school with a cold, you know. They don't have a healthy immune system. And I think the vaccines are actually slowly eroding their immune competence to the point where they're not resistant to anything, and they've got all these antibodies which are actually can cause autoimmune disease. You know, the vaccines are just driving you towards autoimmune disease, and also so to immune deficiency, innate immune deficiency and autoimmune disease. That's basically what we're ending up with
Yeah,
collectively from all these
and
vaccines.
absolutely. And that's what I see clinically is that, and there's been a number of studies published on this too, is the kids who get sort of the full schedule, they may not be diagnosed with autism or have anything prevalent right at that moment, but they're increased eczema, increased colds, flus, all of these things, and it's a massive,
Asthma,
deficient in
eczema.
asthma. Yeah, absolutely. And then on the flip side, when kids get to 20 something, then all of a sudden they get diagnosed with all these autoimmune diseases that didn't
Yes,
exist before.
exactly. It's really incredible how I find it fascinating that we humans seem to be able to adapt to the new normal very quickly, you
Hmm.
know, and that it's perfectly fine that we have all these kids with autism. That's just the way the world is.
Right.
You know, it's weird to me that people don't feel upset by it. Most people seem to be fine with it, you know.
Yeah, it is bizarre, and folks have, I mean, it's very short memory, and
Yeah,
even
exactly.
up into including, what happened sort of 4 years ago, and kind of
Yeah.
just the quote unquote new normal with that. But
And you know, various people getting cancer, and like, you know, yeah, my aunt had cancer. Oh yeah, my father-in-law had cancer. Yeah, of course. I mean, everybody gets cancer. It's like fine, right? It
right.
drives me nuts, actually.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre thing for me, Doc, because we've sort of acquiesced to having a toxic environment, and
Hmm.
glyphosate plays a giant role in that, and we've just sort of accepted that that's okay for some reason.
Hmm.
And there's very few people kind of kicking and screaming outside of you and a select others that are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not right. Like, this isn't what it should be.
Yeah, it's puzzling to me that we don't have and you know, politically, there's just no discussion about it. Like there's all
No,
these different issues in politics, and it doesn't come up, you know,
no.
except for, you know, RFK Jr. He's certainly bringing awareness, but mainstream just seems to think it's fine that we have all these sicknesses. Of course, the healthcare industry does very well, you know, make a lot of money.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And kind of on that point, I did want to talk about deuterium, but since we're on the topic of vaccines, I think you've done some wonderful research with respect to COVID and the
Hmm.
COVID-19 vaccines. Maybe if you wanted to share sort of what you've found with those, that would be
Yeah,
wonderful.
it's incredible. I've studied them very deeply, and right from the get-go, I was suspicious of them, and I started
Mhm.
studying the mRNA technology when I first heard about warp speed back in before the vaccine was even finished. You know,
Yeah.
I started reading about the mRNA technology, and it goes back actually for a couple decades, even to the 1990s.
Yeah.
It took them a long time to get to the point where they thought they had it ready, and I think they believe they're very eager to get it out, and I think that was a big driver behind trying to push everybody towards the vaccine. Like, you can't treat this disease, you know. As
Hmm.
long as you can't treat it, then we can get this emergency use criterion when we don't have to make sure the vaccine's safe. We can just roll it out. And then, I mean, it was shocking to me how much the overreach of demanding and having companies and universities demanding, insisting that people either get that vaccine or they're going to be thrown under the bus. I mean, I just was so shocked that that happened. I could not believe it. I
That is
never
terrifying.
anticipated that it would be that they would have that kind of power, you know. And I know that upset a whole lot of people, including myself. Anyway, I started writing papers on it right away, even
Mhm.
before it was out. And Greg Nye and I published our first paper, I think, in the summer of that first year, when it was
Mhm.
out for 6 months. And we just did a deep dive into the whole thing about the technology. And there's just so much wrong with it that I don't even know where to begin. But it's a very, very unusual technology with this it's not even RNA, it's sort of a modified RNA that's modified in important ways that makes the RNA survive for a very long time. Normally, when the cell is making its own RNA, it makes some RNA, that RNA makes some protein, and then after a few hours, it goes away, it gets broken down. A
Mhm.
few hours. That's typical. And whereas the mRNA in these vaccines has been shown to last for at least a month and maybe even several months. And it can also get converted into DNA and then it becomes permanent. There have been papers that have shown that. So I think there are people who are harboring DNA, that's DNA code from the RNA for the spike protein that got from the vaccine into their own DNA. And it can just be these little circular DNAs that are sitting outside of the genome, not integrated into the human genome, but just these little circular DNAs that have the code, and they keep on making RNA, and that RNA keeps on making spike protein, and so it doesn't go away. So they can still have spike protein. It's been shown that people still have spike protein in their blood months, 6 months after they got the vaccine, it's still there, which is amazing. And then the vaccine is it's so powerful. They were so worried about it not having an adequate response so that you don't get enough antibodies, because the whole point is to make sure you get these antibodies to the spike protein. They went overboard with making sure that the RNA was very efficient at making spike protein fast and making it for a long time, like it couldn't be shut down. They did all kinds of design engineering to make it very sophisticated and very good at what it does, which is forcing you to make antibodies to the spike protein, which is a really bad idea because it actually causes IgG antibodies, high levels of IgG antibodies. And IgG is the category that tends to cause autoimmune disease. Yeah. And that spike protein has all kinds of sequences that are similar to sequences in important human proteins that you can start attacking the human tissues, like the platelets. You can disrupt so many aspects of human biology by autoantibodies that come about because of those antibodies that you produced from the spike protein in the vaccine.
Yeah, and that's to your point, one of the toughest challenges. And I know a lot of docs, well-meaning docs, have put forth different types of protocols and things to mitigate this. But my question has been for a while now, what do we do about the genetic modification? How do we handle that piece of it? Right?
You mean the two amino acids that were changed, you mean?
Right.
Yeah, I know. That's really serious because I think those two prolines, they took two amino acids in the middle of the protein and changed them into proline. And they obviously didn't just do that on a lark. They had a reason to do that.
Right.
And their reason was because they knew that those two prolines would disrupt the ability to break down the protein. So the protein sticks around for a very long time. It also, of course, disrupted the ability for the protein to get inside the cell. So it would stick to the ACE2 receptors. Because of those two prolines, it would stick to the ACE2 receptors and not go inside. Normally, it gets in through the ACE2 receptors, but this prevented it from folding the right way to get in. So it disables the ACE2 receptors, and then you get a whole lot of problems with your blood, with your circulation. Yeah. And it sticks around. It can't be broken down. So a lot of people have spike protein, and also it binds. The spike protein binds very well to things. So it's actually not free form in the blood. And it's, of course, packed inside these exosomes as well, because the cell that's making lots and lots of spike protein has to get rid of it. And so it puts it inside these little lipid particles and ships them out the door. And these are little exosomes. They're called exosomes. They're really cool. They're the way the cells communicate with each other. Yeah. One of the big ways that they communicate is putting things inside these exosomes. So this cell is making lots of spike protein, can't stop doing it. So it piles it into these exosomes and ships them out the door. And then the exosomes circulate all over the body. And everywhere they go, they're delivering the spike protein to that place. And they can deliver it to the neurons in the brain very, very well. And then that causes all kinds of neurological problems.
Yeah, and that's the ramifications of this. I don't think we have seen quite yet, even though it's been a while and people are suffering, unfortunately. But the full ramifications of this, I don't think we've seen quite yet.
We're getting more and more evidence of increased mortality among young people, young adults, like 20 to 40. Yeah. Sharp increases in mortality in all the countries that have been very forceful in getting those vaccines into people's arms. And I think it's eventually going to become obvious that it is the vaccine that's causing this increase in mortality. And it's so stupid that they required the kids to get the vaccine and to go to college, because they're not going to, very, very few of the kids that age are going to die from COVID. Right. They're going to have a mild case if they get it at all. And to insist that they get that vaccine is just criminal, in my opinion. I hope that somebody gets accountable for that. It just made me so angry about because these college-bound kids, you don't want to be destroying their health because they're important contributors to the society. The kids that are going to college, you've got to keep them healthy. And I just was really frustrated.
Yeah, that was an extremely frustrating thing for me too, in that there's a whole generation of kids that have their whole life in front of them, and foreseeably they're just playing Russian roulette at that point, and
Yeah.
it's really unfortunate to see. But with respect to kind of the vaccination issue and the COVID issue, are there things that you've seen, especially with your study on deuterium, that can be helpful? And sort of what is the kind of what is deuterium and how having low deuterium levels can be helpful, especially for the vaccination issue, but also for health in general?
Yeah. So deuterium, let me just tell you what it is. It's heavy hydrogen, which is it's a natural element. It's found everywhere in nature. So hydrogen is the smallest atom, the guy up in the corner on the periodic chart. One proton and one electron, very tiny atom. And hydrogen is the most common by far atom in the universe. And it's the most common by far atom in our body. It's like 60% of our atoms are hydrogen in our body. And deuterium is hydrogen, but it has an extra neutron, which makes it twice as heavy. So it's a version of hydrogen that behaves differently from hydrogen. And hydrogen is incredibly important in all these kinds of redox reactions. Almost every reaction, or most reactions, involve hydrogen in some form or capacity. There's a lot of transfer of hydrogen atoms between two molecules from an enzymatic reaction. And so because the deuterium behaves differently, it can cause trouble for various enzymes, and in particular for the ATPase pumps in the mitochondria. They've been singled out as being extremely sensitive to deuterium. These pumps, I mean, it's interesting how the mitochondria work, and I think it's worth describing this a little bit, because the mitochondria are the organelles inside the cells that provide the ATP that is the energy driver for the cells. That's like their fuel. They need a lot of ATP to be able to do everything that they do, the cells. And the mitochondria, they have a matrix in the middle, and then they have a membrane that has an intramembrane space, an area between the two sides of it. If you can picture this membrane, internal membrane and the external membrane, and then the part in between there is the intramembrane space of the mitochondria. And the matrix is where all this activity happens with the citric acid cycle, where they break down glucose and turn it into carbon dioxide and water. And the water comes from oxygen. So it's sort of oxidative phosphorylation. It's called, this whole process that produces the ATP that's going on also inside the mitochondria. So there's two big things, the citric acid cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation, that happen inside the mitochondria. Yeah. And the citric acid cycle is producing a whole bunch of NADH, and that's coming from niacin. So that's a B vitamin. NADH produced inside the matrix, and then the H is pushed into the intermembrane space by NADH dehydrogenase. That's pulling the hydrogens off of NADH and putting them into the intermembrane space. And so eventually you build a battery, right? You have a higher pH in the matrix and a lower pH inside the intermembrane space. And that lower pH is because you got all those protons in there you've been putting in. You pump all these protons into there. And then those protons come out through the ATPase pumps. They're all sitting at the boundary, the inner membrane of the intermembrane space. And the protons come back out, and there's a proton motive force that drives a wheel, actually, essentially like a wheel in an enzyme, which is the ATPase pump that makes the ATP based on the protons that are pushing through. But the deuterons are twice as big, twice as heavy. They stick better to things. They don't let go. So it's kind of like putting sugar in the gas tank. Right. When you put deuterium into those ATPase pumps, they're not happy. They break. They release reactive oxygen. They don't do their job, get less ATP. Lots of bad things happen. And the cells know this. The cells know they have to deliver low deuterium protons to that intermembrane space. And they've got a very elaborate, very complicated mechanism to do that, which is super, super fascinating. And it involves a whole lot of dehydrogenases, not just the NADH dehydrogenase, but a bunch of others. So I got a little carried away there. It's so fascinating. I started paying attention to before I even knew about deuterium, because it just seemed odd to me that the cell would go through great lengths in some cases to bring an enzyme into the mitochondria and bring the substrate into the mitochondria, do the reaction in the mitochondria, transport the substrate back out of the product, back out of the mitochondria, And it's not easy to get things across those mitochondrial barriers. So I was like, why does it have to go? Why can't it just do it in the cytoplasm? Why does it have to do it in the mitochondria? I was kind of getting obsessed on that until I heard about deuterium, and then it all makes sense, because every reaction that it wants to do inside the mitochondria has to do with making sure there's no deuterium in the intermembrane space. So it's super cool. The biology is just wonderful. It's like all of a sudden the puzzle pieces make sense,
Yes, yes, yes.
in the way that it works. And so I was very happy, and I'm still obsessed with filling in the details of this story. And I'm working right now on a paper that it's really hard to write a paper on deuterium, because there's nothing out there. There's so little. There's some papers published, but the mainstream is completely clueless about deuterium. And so to try to get past the review process, when they don't know anything about it, it's going to be a challenge, I think. I'm hoping I can get this paper published, but we'll see.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And you've talked a lot about the role of diet in keeping deuterium levels low. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, it's really cool. So there's a couple things: water and food. And there are natural waters that are naturally low in deuterium. And they come from glaciers. And in fact, this is how it was the Russians who figured out that deuterium was important for the body. And the Russian scientists, and this was some time ago, but they figured it out because they noticed that people who lived up in Siberia were extremely healthy. And they would live up to be 110, and still be perfect, didn't develop all those diseases of aging that other people develop. They were really healthy, and they couldn't figure out why, because they had a very short growing season, so they didn't eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, So they ate a lot of fat because then they had a lot of fish, and meats. So their diet was fresh fruits and vegetables, which do have lots of good nutrition in them, but they weren't getting those, but it didn't matter. So these people were really healthy, and so the scientists were trying to figure out why, and then finally deuterium. So when you eat a lot of carbohydrates, you're getting a high deuterium diet, whereas if you eat a lot of fats, it can get down to 110 parts per million in the fats as well. And that's because these fats are based on this NADH that has this very carefully controlled low deuterium to build the fats.
That's wonderful. And I think it's interesting to me that the same foods that are low in glyphosate are the same foods that are low in deuterium.
Yeah,
right?
that's interesting, isn't it? Wow. Yeah.
And on the NADH and NAD point, can you talk to me a little bit about just the role of glyphosate in the production of NAD as well, and kind of bring this sort of full circle and kind of how
Yes. Well, so NAD it comes from niacin, and niacin comes from tryptophan, and tryptophan comes from the shikimate pathway, so you can trace it right back to the shikimate pathway, because the microbes are suppressed. They aren't able to make enough tryptophan. They make tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Those are aromatic amino acids through that shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously blocks. So you're not getting enough tryptophan from your microbes, and probably also from your food, because if the food is contaminated with glyphosate, it's going to have trouble making tryptophan. So you're going to have a tryptophan deficient diet, which is going to directly lead to basically a niacin deficient diet. And niacin goes to nicotinamide, which becomes nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which is NAD. So it comes directly from tryptophan. So there's going to be a deficiency in the source to begin with. And then the other problem is the dehydrogenases, because there's all kinds of dehydrogenases involved, starting in the gut and with the gut microbes in producing low deuterium nutrients. In fact, it's super fascinating with the gut microbes, because I have to tell you this part. And I don't even remember how I found this paper from the 1960s. Beautiful paper. I was, of course, searching for papers on deuterium. And this paper they were looking at microbes, and they were looking at hydrogen gas being produced by these microbes using an enzyme called hydrogenase, not dehydrogenase, but hydrogenase.
Okay.
And so again, the human cells don't have that enzyme. None of them have it. But many of the gut microbes have hydrogenase, and they use it to make hydrogen gas. And they make the hydrogen gas by pulling hydrogen off of organic molecules, things like glucose and formate. So they pull the hydrogens off of the organic molecule, put two hydrogens together to make a gas, hydrogen gas. And the hydrogen gas that they made in this experiment was 80% depleted in deuterium. It lost 80% of its deuterium. So that's a fantastic engine for producing low deuterium hydrogen. Now, hydrogen gas is a gas, and it can just go away. So you got to find a way to trap it, right? Well, the microbes figured that out too. So they take the hydrogen gas, they use it as a reducing agent, and they make methane. So they can make methane from hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide. The gut microbes can do that. And they can also make acetate. There's these microbes called acetogenic microbes in the gut that are responsible for making acetate. And acetate is a super important short chain fatty acid. It becomes butyrate. In fact, it can be converted into butyrate. And butyrate is the food of the gods as far as the colon.
Right.
Colonocytes love butyrate. And butyrate comes from acetate. Acetate comes from carbon dioxide and hydrogen gas, so it's got very low deuterium. The acetate that's made by these bugs is a fantastic fuel. And then I think all those short chain fatty acids that the microbes make for the host, and then the host uses all of them very effectively, they're all going to be really low deuterium because they come from that hydrogen gas. And so what happens is glyphosate and all those things that are taking that hydrogen gas in and turning it into organic matter, those are dehydrogenases, many different dehydrogenases, and glyphosate suppresses all of them. There was a study on soil bacteria, and they specifically looked at dehydrogenase activity collectively, all the different dehydrogenases that these microbes are making in the soil. They exposed the bacteria to glyphosate in one shot deal. At one time point, they added glyphosate, and they tracked them over time. And they tracked them up to 3 weeks. They were still, 3 weeks later, they were gradually getting lower and lower levels of activity of the dehydrogenases. So, wow. And of course, there's also been specific papers that have talked about specific dehydrogenases, like succinate dehydrogenase, which is a super important enzyme in the mitochondria. And multiple papers have shown that glyphosate suppresses that succinate dehydrogenase. It's also been shown to suppress glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, which is another super, super important one. So all these dehydrogenases are being suppressed by glyphosate, and that's causing a complete train wreck for the ability to deliver low deuterium protons to the mitochondria. So glyphosate causes mitochondrial disease, basically, and that's a huge part of its toxicity.
Yeah, no, that's fantastically important. And I think this is so important because in healthcare now, there's a move towards sort of just looking outside of the allopathic model, but people are still insistent on gut health things and mitochondrial supplements and things like that. But until we get rid of the glyphosate and until we work on lowering the deuterium levels, to me, those are all moot conversations because it doesn't matter. Because through the exact mechanisms that you just explained, we're destroying our mitochondrial health and our gut at the same time. And so there's no supplement or therapy or anything that's going to fix that until we address this, right?
Absolutely. I think the whole trick is to just stay away from the toxic chemicals, which is, of course, easier said than done because they're all over the place. You know, we're in love with chemicals, it seems like, in this country. We keep rolling out new ones every day.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder about Wegovy, for example. So many people are taking Wegovy now to try to lose weight. We've got this huge obesity problem, which I think is also directly connected to glyphosate.
Yeah.
And people are looking for a quick fix, and it's going to just really come back and bite them, I think.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And this has been absolutely wonderful, Doc. I don't want to keep you too long. I respect your time very much. But the last thing I wanted to ask you really was, and I ask everyone this, is if you had 2 minutes and everyone's attention, what would you say? So if people were going to listen and they understood what you were saying, what would you tell them?
Well, I guess what I would say is that we need to completely refocus the way we do agriculture, and we need to focus on regenerative, not just organic, but regenerative agriculture to try to restore the health of the soil, restore the health of the plants, get rid of all the chemicals that are being used in agriculture, and go back to a natural approach to growing food. And I think that if we did that, we would see so many benefits. We would wonder why we didn't do that a long time ago.
Right. And I do think I see pockets of smart, hardworking, wonderful people realizing this and trying to create honest solutions. And I've always maintained that the closer we can live to nature and in harmony with nature, then we don't have to add chemicals. We don't have to force our hand to all of these things. And the question of, oh, how do we feed X amount of people and all of that? Well, that's very sustainable and possible if we do it the right way.
Yeah, they
so we don't
pretended that we can't live without glyphosate, and the government believes that.
Yeah.
So then they won't even think about the possibility of banning it because they think it's not possible to grow food without it, which seems ridiculous to me because we didn't have glyphosate 40, 50 years ago. We didn't have it.
Right.
And yet we managed to survive. So, you know, we don't have to have this chemical. It's so stupid to say that and to believe that.
Yeah, it really is. And it's to me too, I think it's a very short-sighted thing because with every toxicant in the environment, it's affecting us now, but the younger and younger generations who can't get away from it from the second they're born, just
Yeah,
every successive generation, it causes more problems. So it's very short-sighted, not only for the environment, but for future generations as well.
absolutely. And there's also epigenetic effects. It's been shown that if my
Correct.
grandmother or even my great grandmother was exposed to glyphosate when my grandmother was in utero, then I can have effects from that, even if there was no more glyphosate exposure for the rest of that generation because of the epigenetic effects. It can actually change the genes of the reproductive system of the embryo to impact future generations for up to 7 generations just with the epigenetic effects. So whatever glyphosate we've been exposed to already is going to affect our grandchildren.
Yeah, that's it's a worrying thought, but I do think you have proposed wonderful solutions, and clinically, you know, we're always seeking solutions to these things. But first and foremost, it's get organic, get the toxins out of your system, get sunlight. And that's one of the things I've loved so much about so many of your solutions. It's, hey, let's go back to good sunlight and good water and good food, and let's
Yeah, just
start
live
there.
naturally, really. You
Right.
know, I think that's key.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Doc. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.